Good morning, and thank you for being with us today. I'm sorry we're slightly late on schedule. We're exploring hybrid forms of conference organization, this post-COVID conference, and this conference today on development finance, a Chinese path, is hybrid in many ways. One of our speakers will be joining us via Skype, will be speaking French and English, and I am very lucky to be here, but social distancing, of course. It's very interesting to have this conference today because we have a number of figures and estimates about Chinese aid, and often these figures are controversial. And the fact that the AFD today is welcoming and hosting this debate today is a strong message. I'll now give the floor to Thomas Melonio, Director for Innovation, Research and Knowledge, and Rémi Genevey, Director for EMEA, who both work at the AFD, to tell us more about the conference. Thank you, Tara, and thank you for chairing this discussion. I'd like to thank Agatha Kratz and Marina Rudyak for participating in this conference. A few words to say why this topic is of interest to the AFD. We recently published an article about on the Silk Road, the BRI initiative, and since 2013, since the official launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese banks have accumulated outstanding assets. $450 to $480 billion have been lent to foreign states. It's considerable and comparable to what the World Bank or the Caisse des Dépôts in France has been lending. So these are very high amounts, but and the role of China is more and more put in the limelight. The paradox is that over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a plateau, and the AFD is questioning what's happening and having a look at what's happening to Chinese aid or Chinese activities outside of its borders. One of the explanations is that we're reaching debt ceilings. Indeed, the capacity of a state to borrow money is more and more restricted for many states today. There are also novelties in the development world. China makes up 28% of carbon emissions worldwide, and that also has an impact. And so development in China, but also China's activities outside its borders, is a major challenge for development agencies such as ours and for all organizations combating climate change. A third issue here, in the Chinese narrative over the recent years since the spring 2009, the latest Silk Road Forum, China wants to change the way they intervene abroad. They take into account the possibility of debt distress, and they want the Silk Roads, the BRI, to be more sustainable. And I'd like to now give the floor to Rémi Genevey, who's in charge of our EMEA area. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for all of you for being here today. As Thomas explained, I am in charge of our AFD operations in a region that spans from Manila to Belgrade and includes China. China is a country which is an exception in our area of activity, because China is, on the one hand, a recipient of ODA and also a aid donor. As has just been explained, it's a recipient of ODA. That means that China meets a number of very strict criteria that have been set by the OECD and the Development Aid Committee of the OECD. These criteria are extremely strict. They are linked to interest rates, conditions for aid, and a given duration. aid in most cases mean that there's an international bidding process for the contracts that benefit from this aid. And this is very different from the type of aid that China extends outside of its borders. Indeed, the projects are often very tightly linked to Chinese defense interests, but that's not systematically the case. Indeed, today, Chinese foreign aid is so vast that we have a duty to look at how it works. OECD countries that provide ODA, traditional ODA, if we look at the figures, well, the figures announced by Xi Jinping himself in the inaugural speech for the BRI makes up 40% of a traditional ODA. I think that Agatha and Marina will tell us more about the nature of Chinese aid. Is it truly aid? What interest does Chinese aid serve? Are there any negative externalities? The last item I wanted to mention here is what the AFD does in China. AFD's activities in China are often misunderstood, and it's easy to sum up in a few words what we do there. The AFD in China does not aim at serving Chinese interests, or not only Chinese interests, but the interests of global public goods, including and most notably protecting the planet and the climate. As Thomas said, we have very high climate targets, and any action to combat climate change has an impact on China and for the world at large. And this is a key challenge today. And the action of the AFD in China aims at exactly that, supporting China in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions that will, of course, be beneficial to the Chinese and the world as a whole. And that's what I wanted to mention about AFD aid in China. Thank you very much.
The idea for us is for this event to be as interactive as possible. And so before I introduce our two speakers, I wanted to give you some ground rules. They will each give approximately a 15-minute presentation, after which you will be able to ask one or two questions. So please listen to their presentations very attentively. And we'll have some time dedicated to you guys later on in the conference, and we'll have approximately half an hour of exchange with you. Again, I will be passing on your questions to both of them. And so now, a brief introduction. We have Marina Rudyak with us online. She's a sinologist working on the intersections of China studies and international development. Her research focuses on China as a global development actor, specifically Chinese foreign aid and development lending policy, the implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and China in Central Asia and Africa. She is also interested in the political ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and coded communication in Chinese politics. Her recently completed doctoral dissertation traces the evolution of China's foreign aid since the early days of the PRC and shows how China's aid has always been part of a global history, embedded in a global context, and directly or indirectly shaped by global shifts. Marina is not only a scholar and a researcher, she is also a practitioner. She worked for the German Agency for International Cooperation in Beijing for several years, and she regularly advises organizations and NGOs on matters of Chinese aid. We also have with us today Agatha Kratz, who is Associate Director at the Rhodium Group. Agatha coordinates the group's European activities and leads research on European Union-China relations and China's commercial diplomacy. She contributes to Rhodium work on China's global investment, industrial policy, and technological aspirations. She is also a non-resident adjunct fellow of the Reconnecting Asia project at the CSIS, a big American think tank. She holds a PhD from King's College London on China's railway diplomacy. And I have to say I had the pleasure of working with her as a colleague at ECFR previously. So if you have an idea, basically we'll start with Agatha and then go on to Marina. But to give you a quick teasing of how this is going to proceed, if you see Chinese development aid as a black box. Basically, what Agatha will do is explain to us what they are, and what Marina will explain to us is what they do. Agatha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The pace today was going to be reversed, and Marina was going to introduce first the institutional setup for China's development financing, overseas financing. So you're going to get it in reverse. What I was trying to do was trying to give you a primer of what China's development financing looks like. And what we do at the Rhodium Group is economics research, and so we look at data. So from the black box, we look at what comes out of it. But Marina will untangle what is in the black box. So going 2 slides down, Tara, please. I want to start by just presenting a very broad overview of what China's financing tools to developing and emerging countries look like. China's financing channels actually span way beyond aid. You've got aid-like channel on the one hand, which Marina will focus on. She would have focused on if she had gone first. You've got commercial channels from commercial lending to foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, and you've got other kinds of tools. Currency swaps are one of the examples, but many more. And what is really hard when thinking about China's financing and development financing in particular is understanding how to distinguish it and compare it with our own development financing, Western development financing, OECD development financing, because it's both slightly similar but pretty different. So I'm going to try and explain that today in a little bit more detail. If we keep to that slide, and I would like everyone's attention to be on that because I'm gonna use it. If you take grants and if you take zero interest loans, those are pretty vanilla, so to say, ODA tools. They're subsidized, they're non-tied for the most part, some of them, but they're non-tied for the most part. They're pretty obvious kind of ODA type instruments. But it gets blurrier as soon as you step out of that zone, which is only two of the many categories you've got on the slide. If you move to concessional lending, everyone thinking about concessional lending will think about ODA, but actually China's concessional lending is a little bit more complicated. Concessional lending is part of China, what China defines as aid, but actually, and we're going to see that in many cases, the concessionality of Chinese aid is actually to be discussed and not as straightforward as OECD concessional lending. Moving to preferential lending, China doesn't consider preferential lending as part of its aid toolbox, so to say, but it still makes part of China's aid-like channel because it is subsidized lending. And we're going to speak about that, and we're going to speak about why China subsidizes those lending channels and whether that makes it ODA, aid, development financing, or something else. And where it gets even more complicated is looking at commercial lending, because commercial lending for any other country in the world would not qualify as development financing. But a lot of countries receiving Chinese aid will consider that Chinese lending, commercial lending, because a lot of it takes the shape of G2G agreements, government-to-government discussion, is disbursed by China's policy banks, which are very tightly linked to the government, and we'll speak about that, is actually development financing, but on commercial terms. So just to say here that the picture is very blurry, it's very complicated to exactly determine what corresponds to what we clearly define as ODA and what corresponds to China's own model, own characteristic of development financing. So if we move to the next slide, I want to focus here and today on China's overseas lending, because as I said, grants and zero interest loans to a certain extent, but grants are pretty easy and clear to understand. But the bulk of what China does overseas is lending. It's not FDI, it's not investment, it's not swaps, it's not grants, it's really lending. And that's the core of what we're speaking about. And when we're speaking about lending, we need to understand what are the different kinds of lending, and we need to understand what is the most important part of that. Because a lot of people would think, or a lot of the media picking up on Chinese Belt and Road projects will think that most of what China does with the Belt and Road, most of what China does with development financing is concessional, preferential, it's win-win, it's developmental. But actually, if you look at the breakdown between zero interest loans, which are very, very small as a percentage of China's lending, government concessional loan, preferential concessional loan, which are subsidized lending and make up about a quarter of China's overseas lending. At the end of the day, what China extends to the world is commercial loans. And once again, it can be disguised or it can be described as developmental, win-win, and a partnership between South and South countries. But most of what China extends to the world, and numbers are complicated here, we can get into that at the Q&A session, but most of what China extends to the world is 60 to 75% commercial loans, commercial term loans. So it's extremely important to understand that, because when one thinks about Belt and Road, most of it is lending, most of it is commercial. But a key point I wanted to make. Now, diving into the detail, if we get to the next slide, I want to go very, very quickly on zero interest loans, because once again, they represent less than 1% of the total. A lot of it goes to Africa, so it's relevant, of course, for AFD and other institutions such as it. But I want to be quick, because alongside with grants, they're probably what's the closest to OECD type ODA. They're extended at 0% interest rate. They're extended by MOFCOM, typically for very small size projects, 2 million to 80 million. We've seen a couple of cases over 100 million USD, but it's really rare. Typically to lowest income countries. This is important to note, because some people think that China will expand lending without any kind of consideration to the situation of the recipient, but actually that's untrue. Lowest income country get the most zero interest loans and preferential loans, and middle income emerging countries get the most commercial loans. So just important to keep that in mind. The other thing that's really important to understand is that zero interest loans have actually decreased as a percentage of China's foreign aid. They've progressively been replaced by concessional and preferential lending, which increases the amount of interest-bearing lending that China does overseas. And finally, and crucial for the situation we're facing today with COVID, with DSSI, with debt renegotiations happening throughout the world, zero interest loans are the only type of bilateral Chinese loans that can be officially written off and renegotiated, where there's a formal process around them. So it's very important to understand that only 0.5% of all Chinese loans can be formally written off. Now, moving to what's more important here, and to the next slide, we're diving into interest-bearing lending, Chinese lending, so concessional and preferential lending. Both of those are extended by China's Exim, which is a policy bank in charge of China's aid portfolio. But only government concessional loans are considered aid by China, and preferential buyer's credits are not. But both of them are subsidized. So I put them together here as a type of subsidized Chinese lending. They're typically larger than zero interest loan. They typically go to bigger projects. They're typically going to infrastructure, dams, power, and they're typically termed or presented in government-to-government meetings as concessional or preferential. But at the end of the day, many do not meet OECD definitions for concessionality. They usually have a higher interest rate, much higher interest rate than formal ODA and rates that we would see from other development lenders, 2 to 3% fixed rate, almost always. And very importantly, they're almost always, if not always, tied to the use of Chinese goods and services. And they are used to promote Chinese firms, Chinese projects. So that's a very, very big deviation from the OECD model, of course. And as a matter of fact, preferential buyer's credit, which is an export credit, is the biggest chunk of both of those. You'll have at least twice as much preferential buyer's credits typically than you would get government concessional loans. Another last point that's really important is that those loans are not eligible for forgiveness, which means that we're getting into a territory where negotiations need to be ad hoc. There needs to be renegotiating, restructuring, and so forgiveness is not an option, and that's important in the context of the SSI today. Now, to the biggest chunk of China's overseas lending, which is commercial. This is really the bulk of what is at stake today when we speak about debt crisis throughout the world, China's overseas lending, debt trap diplomacy, which we're going to speak about in a few minutes. Commercial lending is typically extended for the largest infrastructure projects or energy projects that China promotes, or for direct open lines of credit to government. So 2 billion being extended to Ghana for doing an infrastructure project, but directly to the government. Typically LIBOR plus margin, most of the cases tied to the purchase of Chinese good once again. So although it's described as win-win, it's always linked to the purchase of Chinese good. It integrates a premium based on project type and country. So here, once again, China does not extend lending without conditions. It does tailor its terms to the country it lends to. And actually, most commercial lending goes to, once again, emerging countries or middle-income countries rather than low-income countries. The main actors here are still China Exim Bank. As a matter of fact, China Exim Bank lends more under commercial terms than it does under preferential or concessional terms. And the second biggest actor, and Marina will describe them later on, is CDB, both of which are policy banks, and so non-commercial banks very directly linked to the Chinese government, which once again blurs really the line between the two types of lending. Once again, not eligible for forgiveness, which is making everything complicated today. I think we can actually skip the next slide. We can get back to that because Marina is going to get there. But I want to speak quickly about main destination before we get to the problems that Chinese overseas lending can cause. And for main destination, I want to touch here really quickly about the opaqueness of Chinese overseas lending, which makes it very, very hard to know where it lends, to which countries it lends, and exactly what's happening. We've got estimates, you mentioned 450 billion potentially. Some other estimates are closer to 250 or 300. It's really, really hard to know. So I've put here on the slide 3 different data sets that will put different countries as the main recipient of Chinese lending. But the main thing to see here is that those data sets, when you cross-reference them, point to the same recurring countries as top Chinese recipients. Angola, Pakistan, Ecuador, Russia, Laos, Ethiopia, and Kenya repeatedly identified as key recipient, repeatedly identified as problematic cases. We're going to speak about that in a minute. And Venezuela and Zambia, not as much, but they're well-known recipient of Chinese lending and major borrower. So just wanted to explain not just the how, but the where the money flows. Now to the core of the question, if we get to the next slide, is what's the problem with Chinese lending? Is it a debt trap? I hate to use that word, but I know that everyone is expecting it. So we're going to dive into that and finish up with a little bit of discussion about that. So if we go to the next slide, what actually happens, and this is very important, what actually happens when Chinese debt gets renegotiated? There's 3 things and 3 points I want to make here very clearly. The first one is asset seizures are extremely rare, if inexistent. The only case we could find, and we spent about a year now looking into cases of Chinese debt renegotiation, the only case we could find of a potential asset seizure was the Hambantota port, which is cited by everyone. But it's the only case we could find, and where there's actually a lot of debate about whether that's an asset seizure and a debt for equity swap or not. Write-offs are actually very, very common, but they're extremely small amounts. So they don't really count. If you look at the pie chart on the right-hand side, you see that write-offs are about 20% of the amounts being renegotiated. So they're actually almost irrelevant in terms of the mass of Chinese lending being extended. What is more important is that besides write-offs for ZILs, and those are mainly ZILs, what's increasing over the past few years is renegotiations of commercial lending. And those lead to a much more diverse series of outcomes. A lot of deferrals, actually, a lot of refinancing, a lot of rediscussion of terms, a lot of rediscussion of repayment period and interest rates. And so actually, when Chinese get debts renegotiated, there's very, very little asset seizure. So that's the main point. If we get to the next slide, I want to just point out what the issues actually are with Chinese financing, beyond this idea of a debt trap narrative. The real problem is that Chinese lending, and I said it already, is opaque. It is tight, and I've said that already, describing the different channels. And it goes to highly indebted nation and unsustainable projects. And on this slide, you see that the main borrowers from China, if we look at one of the data sets that we have available, most of them have very bad sovereign credit rating. So Chinese lending actually flows quite often to countries with less sustainable macroeconomic conditions, financial conditions. And that's really where the problem is, because it creates unsustainability and it creates potential debt crisis when we get into a COVID situation and a global pandemic. It also goes to some unsustainable projects. We've seen the Standard Gauge Railway run into some trouble. We've seen projects in Laos, grid projects in Laos, run into some trouble. And that's also one of the big problems and differences. Now, what should we expect for the future if we get to the next slide? More renegotiation, they're coming up. More renegotiation because a lot of Belt and Road projects are coming due in the next few years because Chinese lending has been ramping up beyond ZILs into all kinds of other loans since 2008, and that's getting more and more and more renegotiation. You add on top of that COVID trends and a global pandemic, and you've got huge problems facing China. And lastly, just a quick point on my last point on the most recent renegotiation and an update. Over the past few years, we've seen almost 20 cases of renegotiation. A lot of them have been triggered by COVID. A lot of them are Angola, Pakistan, and Venezuela, which are repeat cases of problem for Chinese overseas lending, but many more countries running into trouble. So we're going to need to look at that very, very carefully. Now, the problem here, and I'm glad that Marina comes next actually for that, is that CDB is such a big player in those renegotiations. If you look at the pie chart, CDB has the most in value in terms of renegotiation, which means that a commercial Chinese bank, not an aid link or an aid mandated Chinese bank, which is Exim, is at the table. And the blurriness of Exim's role versus CDB's role and the specific status of CDB makes it very, very complicated for the future. So I'm going to leave it here, and I'm very glad to see Marina finally on the screen and back with us.
Thank you so much, Agatha. I have two questions from the chat, and we'll try and deal with them very quickly, under 5 minutes if possible. One of them is a question about whether you could develop the case of Pakistan. So I don't know if that goes to the Gwadar port or the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but if you have maybe an example to give a kind of case study, I think that would probably help the audience. And the second question is, what is the link between the investment of these banks within China and their investments outside of China?
On the case of Pakistan, I'm not completely sure what kind of data point we're interested in. But interesting for Pakistan is the huge, as a representation of Belt and Road PR, I guess, is the huge communication there is about the win-win relationship between Pakistan and China. Pakistan as a preferred actor within China's global lending, global commercial diplomacy, Belt and Road Initiative. But actually, when you look at cases of Chinese lending in Pakistan, a lot of them are commercial or mixed commercial and concessional. So at the end of the day, the attractiveness of Chinese lending is for it to be there. But in that kind of relationship, even if both sides consider it to be development finance and a development partnership, a lot of it is commercial. So I think that's actually a nice illustration of that point. And it's also a nice illustration of cases of that needing to be renegotiated in the very near future. On the interaction between inside and outside of China, Exim is mostly external. So there's actually very little links other than the overall global kind of stability and resilience of the Chinese financial system. But at the end of the day, China extends, or at the height of the Belt and Road Initiative, China extended about 50, 60 billion per year USD of overseas lending every single year. That is compared to 2 trillion every year being extended in China on China's domestic banking sector. So the links exist. CDB is also a lender in China, and on the internal market, it has a very, very important development role. But at the end of the day, if China wants to continue lending through CDB and Exim abroad, those 60 billion are very, very easy to find in a 2 trillion banking system. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for keeping it short. Marina, it's great to have you, albeit online only. I think your presentation is going to come really as very complementary to what Agatha just said, and we're really looking forward to your presentation on the aid architecture in China. So the floor is yours.
Hey, from Heidelberg to Paris. It's a pleasure to join you this morning. In my presentation, I will introduce to you the architecture of Chinese development cooperation, the institutional actors behind the different development finance flows, and how the different actors relate to each other. The main challenge to anybody who wants to study and track Chinese development finance is the high level of complexity and bureaucratic fragmentation. It's not only external observers, but Chinese scholars and policymakers too, who complain about the opaqueness and the lack of transparency. In total, about 25 ministries and central-level government agencies are involved in China's foreign aid, plus their provincial subsidiaries. Chinese official development finance is delivered through a number of different channels and in different forms. These are grants, zero-interest loans, concessional loans, export buyers credits, and medium and long-term project loans. Additionally, there are also loans provided by China's 4 state-owned commercial banks, which are not part of China's official finance. From the outside, it's really difficult to distinguish which projects are what, and what is aid, what is other official finance, and what is commercial. Recently, I participated at a workshop with several Southeast Asian think tanks who try to monitor Chinese development finance flows. And they said that when they look at Chinese projects, I quote, "For us, it's all China. Only grants, zero-interest loans, and concessional loans are China's foreign aid." Grants are mostly used for humanitarian aid and human resources development. Zero-interest loans are usually used for public infrastructure or industrial and agricultural production. They are renminbi denominated and have a 20 years maturity and 10 years grace period. They can be repaid using either convertible currency, commodities, or any other agreed means. Concessional loans are mainly used for large-scale infrastructure construction or provision of large quantity of mechanical and electronic products. They are also renminbi denominated and have usually a fixed interest rate of 2 to 3% with 15 to 20 years maturity and a grace period of 5 years. About 1/3 to 1/2 of China's foreign aid meets the OECD DAC concessionality criteria and is thus comparable with DAC aid. By the way, if we hear about Chinese debt forgiveness, it applies almost exclusively to zero-interest loans. Other types of loans are typically rescheduled. Concessional loans are the main form of China's foreign aid. Originally, they were introduced in 1995 and were adopted from the Japanese model of foreign aid. How they work is that otherwise commercial loan of the China Exim Bank is subsidized by the Chinese government, which allows to count the whole loan as foreign aid, although only the subsidy part comes from the foreign aid budget, and the loans are conditional on the implementation of the project by a Chinese company and use of Chinese goods. So this way, back then, this allowed China to support the internationalization of its own companies, while at the same time helping other countries' development issues. This was the original idea of the win-win. And this explains to you also probably why till 2018 Chinese foreign aid was administered by the Ministry of Commerce and its predecessors, because foreign aid was always thought very closely with foreign trade and foreign investment. Then in March 2018, the Department of Foreign Aid within the Ministry of Commerce, which had been responsible for coordinating aid, was taken out and upgraded into a new vice ministry level agency, CITCA, China's International Development Cooperation Agency. CITCA's mandate now includes aid negotiations and signing of international agreements, drafting of country strategies for recipient countries, allocation of aid funds, decision on projects, supervision and evaluation of project implementation, aid policy reviews, and ensuring alignment between aid and the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, if you wonder why there was no dedicated aid agency before the 2018, it's worth knowing that debates about whether China needs an aid agency or not have been ongoing since the mid-2000s, when Chinese aid began to grow, and it became clear that the existing system with the Department of Foreign Aid, which was in place back then, was not really fit for coping with the workload amount. And the staffing of the Department of Foreign Aid back then was 100 people, and it's been like that since the early 80s. So while Chinese aid grew exponentially, the staffing of the department that was in charge of aid was never increased. However, the Ministry of Commerce was always quite strong in China's bureaucracy and prevented aid being taken away. Also because, as estimates from 2017 have shown, aid was more or less about 80% of the Ministry of Commerce's budget. Now, under Xi Jinping, those cadres who are in charge of foreign policy became more powerful, and this enabled to take aid out from the Ministry of Commerce and make it into an independent agency, which was closer to China's overall foreign policy, as CITCA now reports to the Central Foreign Affairs Commission and to the State Council, and within the State Council to the State Councillor Wang Yi, who is also China's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, CITCA was established to make the whole aid management process more effective and efficient. And actually, this likely goes back to a decision by Xi Jinping himself, who, after the Foreign Affairs Leading Group meeting in February 2017, stated that Chinese aid has to become more effective. However, besides CITCA's establishment as the new aid agency, the rest of China's foreign aid system remained as it was pre-reform. This means that the Ministry of Commerce is still in charge of the implementation of the largest part of foreign aid projects, and the line ministries are also still in charge of their parts. Now, CITCA has the task of political coordination, but being a vice ministry, it is below in the ranks than those government agencies it is supposed to coordinate. Furthermore, there is, as of now, no legal basis to govern CITCA's interactions with other ministries. And this is perceived by Chinese observers as a major obstacle to efficiency in China's aid system and also to transparency. Now, to give you a comparative example, in Germany, there is a regulation that mandates government agencies to make decisions on the lowest possible level. In China, something like that does not exist. Instead, it's a system which is called bureaucratic stovepiping, meaning that every government agencies would play up issues in the hierarchy till they reach the level of the State Council or the Politburo to be decided there. Now, let's take a look at how CITCA interacts with other actors inside China's aid system. Usually, the start of an aid project is signing of a bilateral aid agreement between CITCA on behalf of the Chinese government and the recipient country government. Then, for all foreign aid projects, CITCA conducts a joint political project review with the Ministry of Commerce's Department of Outward Investment and Economic Cooperation. Then, for specific subject areas, line ministries get involved in project implementation. For example, if a project is related to agriculture, then the Ministry of Agriculture gets involved. If we take the case of agricultural technology demonstration centers in Africa, then CITCA is in charge of the political coordination, the Ministry of Agriculture is in charge of the agricultural aspect, then the project gets handed down to a provincial level where a provincial Department of Agriculture gets involved and delegates the implementation to a provincial company, which then implements it in Africa. For public health, the National Health Commission gets involved, and again, mostly its provincial subsidiaries. Chinese provinces have all a partner country in Africa. Some bigger provinces have two, and then the provincial health commission would contact provincial hospitals who would then set up medical teams to be sent to Africa. Now, for Turnkey projects, or complete set projects as they are also called, and which constitute the largest part of Chinese foreign aid, the Agency for International Economic Cooperation is in charge of the implementation. Complete set projects are funded mostly by foreign aid concessional loans. And foreign aid concessional loans are approved by SIDCA and disbursed by the China Exim Bank. Concessional loan projects are implemented by Chinese companies, mostly state-owned enterprises. And for that, a company has to be accredited as a foreign aid enterprise by MOFCOM's ACO. The list of accredited companies is, by the way, openly accessible on MOFCOM's webpage. China International Center for Economic and Technical Exchanges, CICET, under MOFCOM, manages goods and material aid, which are mostly grant aid. And the Academy for International Business Officials, IBO, is in charge of foreign aid training programs, which are also mostly part of grant aid. Now, you should be aware that SIDCA has to manage this level of coordination with a staffing of about 100 people. They have to manage about 25 times as much aid budget per person as their colleagues in the German BMZ. And I think this is really important to understand the dimensions and the complexity of Chinese aid management. Also, SIDCA does not have a presence on the ground to monitor the implementation of Chinese foreign aid projects on the spot. This task is still within the Economic and Commercial Counselors' offices of the Ministry of Commerce, as it was when the Ministry of Commerce was in charge of Chinese aid. For them, aid is only one item in their otherwise large portfolio, and they have no mandate to make decisions on the side. Everything has to be coordinated with Beijing, which probably explains to you why they are rarely present at donor coordination rounds in recipient countries. Also, traditionally, MOFCOM rather understands itself as a lobby for Chinese companies than a government agency that should monitor the implementation of aid projects. Another aspect that is quite relevant for Western aid agencies who want to engage with China in trilateral cooperation is that so far MOFCOM also has remained the focal point for international donors, or more specifically, its Department of International Trade and Economic Affairs, DITEA, which had been the focus point for incoming aid to China. Now, when donors started phasing out bilateral aid, it still remained the focal point, and it still sees as its mandate to attract donor money to China, and it also does not really interact directly with SIDCA. As I mentioned initially, China has 5 channels to provide official finance. Of them, only grants, zero-interest loans, and concessional loans are part of foreign aid. Preferential export bias credits and export bias credits of the China Exim Bank and loans of the China Development Bank are not foreign aid. I will not discuss the non-aid loans in detail, this is part of Agatha's presentation, but I will highlight the implications of the opaqueness of China's aid system. This is a screenshot of the ODA database of Cambodia. And here you see foreign aid loans in Chinese yuan and preferential export bias credits in US dollar. Recipients may not be aware of the difference between aid and preferential export bias credits, which are in essence Chinese export subsidies. And second, as you see in this graph, which shows foreign aid flows in blue and preferential export bias credits in red, the preferential export bias credits are actually much higher than aid. And if both are listed together in an ODA database, Chinese aid appears much bigger than it actually is, also relative to DAC ODA. If you add CDB loans, the picture looks again quite different, as you see in this graph for Africa. Here only the dark blue part refers to foreign aid, while the rest are of other official finance and vague flows. And for recipients and for external observers, it's really easy to misperceive CDB loans too as foreign aid. The misperception about the nature of EXIM and CDB loans also extends to the institutions themselves. It is widely assumed that the policy banks are subordinate to another government agency like they are in other countries. The widest misperception is that they are subordinate to the Ministry of Finance, which represents China in multilateral lending dialogues. But this is not the case, as in China, the bilateral and the multilateral system are actually quite strictly separated. The China Development Bank has a rank of a ministry, and the China Exim Bank has a rank of a vice ministry. So unlike in other countries, they are not under the Ministry of Finance. They are directly under the State Council and are supervised by the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission on behalf of the State Council. Although they are policy banks, they are in a way hybrids, as they operate on a mix of political and commercial incentives. The CDB in particular often competes with China's commercial banks. Now, the policy banks are an excellent example of why we really need to follow the communication in Chinese and how little we know if we don't read Chinese sources. In 2017, in the midst of the debt trap debate, China issued first ever credit risk management regulations for the policy banks. The regulators, by the way, studied similar regulations in other countries and borrowed a lot from Japan and also from the German KfW law. First, this tells you that Chinese policy banks were operating without specific regulations since their founding in 1994. This is quite difficult to believe, given that the CDB is actually the world's largest bilateral lender. Now, if you read the regulations and the debate around them, you would know that the Chinese government perceived the debt trap as a creditor trap for China. The Chinese discourse describes the policy banks as immature, which is again difficult to believe if you consider that the CDB is the largest bilateral lender worldwide. But this is the case. The regulations, which I will show you briefly in a minute, went completely unnoticed in the Western debate because there was no announcement in English. But actually, they were much more important for the issue of the debt sustainability than the Belt and Road Debt Sustainability Framework, which was announced during the Belt and Road Forum in spring 2019. You can see that the regulations mandate the banks to work in a prudent and stable way, strengthen capital control, achieve long-term sustainable development. There are 16 articles devoted to credit risk management, stating that the CDB should establish a risk management system, a risk management mechanism, risk management policies, a risk reporting system, that it should develop rules and conduct assessment for credit risks, country risks, interest risks, reputational risks, environmental and social risks. It should establish the unified credit granting system, establish a country risk management system, prudently assess the legitimacy of overseas collaterals, carry out risk assessment and rating of countries and regions, and take the initiative to effectively prevent reputational risks, strengthen environmental and social risk assessment, and develop and improve reputational risk monitoring mechanisms. What this tells you is that these kinds of regulations simply had not been in place prior to 2017. And they went completely unnoticed in the Western debate. I really checked whether I could find that somebody picked it up, and there was a side note in Center for Global Development publications, but no detailed analysis. So what is the role of the Ministry of Finance then? The Ministry of Finance is responsible for China's multilateral lending, and it seconds personnel to the World Bank and the IMF, and it represents China in multilateral debt renegotiations. But it does have no power over the the CDB and the EXIM, although it sits on their boards. The Ministry of Finance is involved in debt relief, where it is part of a committee made up of the Ministry of Commerce, the CDB and EXIM, and where each loan is evaluated individually and case by case, but it appears not to have more voting rights than the other actor. This positioning also explains why the Belgian debt sustainability framework is non-mandatory, which, by the way, is something that has been picked up very little in the international debate. It cannot be mandatory by definition because the Ministry of Finance has no power over the policy banks. Now the question is, was it then just a fig leaf? And I don't think so, because the Ministry of Finance is relatively international in mindset compared to other Chinese bureaucratic actors. And this is partly explained by the fact that its senior personnel rotates to the World Bank and the IMF. The vice minister who is responsible for international cooperation, for example, served many years with the World Bank. And this is quite a big contrast to the senior leadership of the CDB or the Exim Bank. For the CDB, for example, almost everybody came from the Agricultural Bank of China. It appears that with the DSF, the Ministry of Finance wanted to show that it wanted to respond to the international concerns and to push for more international standards. But its position in China's political landscape is not strong enough to push it through. And this is something that's really important to understand for European aid policymakers. Now, finally, a quick look at the implementing actors of Chinese foreign aid and official development finance, the Chinese companies. Projects funded with loans by the Chinese government are mostly implemented by state-owned enterprises. Large SOEs are mostly ranked as vice ministries or ministries, and their CEOs are typically promoted to high-level posts in central or provincial governments. Now, in cadre evaluation by the organizational department of the Communist Party, environmental and climate protection factors or adhering to international standards are less significant than contributing to corporate growth. Therefore, companies have rather little incentives for good environmental governance or social impact, and therefore rather little awareness. Now, coming to the end, what do I see as the biggest challenge for responses to our cooperation with China? I believe that the language barrier is actually the biggest challenge because it has created a black box hypothesis. Many European stakeholders think that the Chinese aid system is per se very opaque and intransparent. It is not very transparent, but we have to be aware that about 10% of all information that is openly accessible on Chinese government websites and in think tank publications in Chinese language is translated into English. So a lot of information, and especially many new policies, like I showed with the policy bank's credit risk management regulations, go unnoticed because they are not translated. And the Chinese government is aware that the language is a barrier. So when it wants to keep something, let's say China internal, it's just not translated. And this has created a huge asymmetry of knowledge between the EU and China. And the EU really needs to invest in China and Chinese literacy. Thank you very much for your attention.
So I guess I'll have a few questions for you, Agatha. I think in terms of the diversity of the schemes that you presented, and typically there are a number of questions that are appearing on the chat right now about the links between the AIIB, so the Asian Investment Bank, and the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, how the two are linked, and the fact that initially the AIIB was perceived as a major actor, was perceived as a future major actor in Africa, and the reality of the figures is that it's actually not that massive an investor right now. So maybe could you give us a few points on that and a few elements on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really good question. The first thing to say is that it's not an investor; it's a lender, and that's a very, very big distinction for to be made when we try and understand Chinese overseas presence. Because a lot of people think it comes in the form of investment. It actually comes in the form of lending, which you need to pay back. So very different picture. But on the AIB itself, I think the numbers that I presented speak for themselves. AIB is, I think, at its creation, 10 billion in capital, about 2 billion to be disbursed as an objective per year. If we take the numbers that I cited, which is about 50 billion of Chinese lending being disbursed per year, and we compare that to the yearly kind of lending target, 2 to 3 billion, I think there was discussion of increasing it a little bit. It's a very, very small part of the pie. It's a non-insignificant part of the pie. It's a better part of the pie. It's a more visible, it's a more sustainable, less opaque part of the pie, but it just blurs, or it just is one tiny piece of the much bigger picture. And so, considering Belt and Road as kind of akin to AIB is actually the wrong way to go. Belt and Road is Exim and CDB extending lending for projects, and AIB doing a little bit of its part, doing it well, but simply on very, very different terms.
Thank you so much. I'll add Thomas and Rémi to the debate as well now. Maybe you could explain on what the recommendations are for European agencies to act in China. Rémi, you hinted to that a little bit at the beginning of your presentation, but I think it would be helpful for us to understand also what are the divergences and convergences of what Europeans, France, and China can do together. Thanks.
It means that eventually, if a loan made by Exim Bank or CDB is not reimbursed, Sinosure will be appealed as a guarantor, and therefore, in the current period, we have seen the policy banks having to price the cost of this coverage to their clients or to the countries, to the borrower, which has led to a limitation of Chinese loans. So it's an important part of the Chinese system because it moderates the level and the volume of Chinese loans abroad, because basically Sinosure will have to examine and price the country risk, and it's an important feature in the system. Maybe it was not so 5 or 10 years ago when general country risk in the world was considered low, but now, since we are in a more risky environment globally, Sinosure will play a more prominent role.
Rémi, do you want to add a word, maybe?
Not really to what Thomas just said. What is true is that Sinosure adds a significant markup on Chinese loan offering in the countries where they operate, and we have experienced that as we are trying to work up things with CDB in African countries to see whether we can find a way to do things together to extend development finance on both sides, applying the rules that we play by, the OECD rules with a competitive bidding. So Sinosure is a player that we have to take into account in this picture. With respect to what we do in China, which was also your question, there are not many ODA providers left in China for obvious reasons. China is a middle-income country of the upper tranche, so most of the aid provider, ODA provider, who only have the grant instrument as an operation for development finance, they have all left. So the ones that are left are only the ones that have the loan instruments. That leaves mainly the big multilaterals. That's the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and of course also the AIIB, which is a recent player and hasn't done much in China yet. And as bilaterals, the one that I see that are left are EIB, that is considered as a bilateral lender. The KfW, the German institute, the German sister company to AFD, AFD ourselves, and that is all, I think. The JICA, for different reasons, has left, the Japanese institution has left China. So we are not many, so to say, competitors in China, and we all have basically the same strategic targets around the good governance and climate.
Thanks so much. I have a few questions of my own, but there are a number of questions on the chat. I'll just put three of them out there right now. There's one question specifically for you, Agatha, which is someone is asking if you can explain again what you call the debt trap narrative, if you can come back to that. And a number of questions on the BRI, and I'll take two of them, and I think this should be for the three of you. Could you explain in more details how the BRI initiative is different from what other massive lenders and global development actors do, specifically France and the USA? And the second question, which is linked to that, I guess, is how the BRI has changed China's approach to development aid. Can we maybe start with Agatha, then Thomas, and then Rémi again?
I mean, very quickly on the debt trap narrative, and then I'm looking forward to your answers on the other questions as well. On the debt trap narrative, this is an idea that has come out after the Hambantota port was transferred to Chinese control. Sorry, what did I say?
No, it's good. I was just saying in Sri Lanka.
All right. Okay, so no mistake on my... but after the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota was transferred to Chinese control a few years back, a lot of people started thinking and asking themselves if China wasn't purposely on purpose extending huge amounts of unsustainable lending to countries that, as I showed, many of them don't necessarily have the means to repay back for either too much lending or unsustainable project, and the Hambantota port is one of those examples, so as to be in a position to grab or to seize strategic assets throughout the world. And so what I'm trying to say and what we're trying to say, I think Marina would be in agreement with me, is that there isn't purportedly wrongful lending. There is bad lending, certainly, and I've said that. There is actors in China, CDB or Exim, trying to recoup their losses in certain ways, and it happened to be through a port in Hambantota. But at the end of the day, asset seizures are almost inexistent. So this is the key part. Now, interestingly enough, if you reverse that and you think about a debt trap from the Chinese point of view, and if you look at all of the cases we looked at of Chinese debt renegotiation, and it gets a little bit technical, but follow me here, we've seen that in total China has renegotiated over the past 20 years between 50 and 70 to 80, we're still compiling the number, billion USD of loans. So that means that the share of non-profitable loans in the whole of the portfolio of Chinese overseas lending, if we take rule of thumb, some of the estimates we know about 400 billion of Chinese overseas lending, if 80% of that 80 billion of that, 20% of that goes wrong, this is extremely bad lending, and this is extremely bad for the lenders themselves. And so the debt trap might be in reverse, in that CDB and Exim face 20% of renegotiation on some of their loans. Some of them have not even started. COVID is hitting. Belt and Road projects are coming due in 2021, 2022. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more nuance in the debate, because the problem China is facing at the moment is enormous in terms of renegotiations.
There was a question on whether the Chinese external policy is comparable or not to that of France or Germany, let's say. So there are some points of comparison. As Agatha was presenting earlier on, France, like China, does non-concessional lending, concessional lending, and grants. So on first level of analysis, you could say that it's comparable. However, if you compare the proportion of concessional, non-concessional lending and grants, it's entirely different. In China, as it was presented earlier, non-concessional loans will be the bulk of the financing abroad, with concessional lending in second and grants in third. In France, for example, it'd be a totally different order, with concessional lending first, grants second, and non-concessional lending third. That could be comparable to Germany, for example. A second big difference is the countries that benefit from this financing or receive this financing. As it was shown earlier, China, having come to a certain extent as the last lender, has chosen and extended loans mostly to countries, in particular energy-rich countries, but also those who had some financial difficulties and found it hard to finance their investment through markets or traditional donors. So the set of countries that benefit from Chinese financing is very different from that of France, Germany, or the World Bank, maybe for historical reasons, but also because in the last 10 years, the risk-taking policy of China was very different from that of other donors. And typically one, I think, very big stake for the coming years is that we managed to reach a joint debt sustainability framework together with China. Last year, China has published a framework for debt sustainability. We don't know yet the parameters of the framework. The general structure of the Chinese debt sustainability framework published by the Ministry of Finance looks like that of the IMF and the World Bank. But of course, the application of this framework, the parameters, the debt ceilings, for example, applied to a country are not known yet. So it's a very big stake for the coming years, and we certainly hope that we'll find common ground with China so that debt sustainability can be managed the same way globally. Otherwise, the debt restructuring that are coming in will be very difficult and long, and of course the countries in such situation will suffer quite a lot if we don't manage amongst the lenders to harmonize conditions. So it's really one of the, I think, biggest challenge ahead is to harmonize such conditions.
Well, with a view to doing what Thomas just explained, I will say that what we're trying to do now is work with particularly the CDB, the policy bank that has just been mentioned, in the field. The Chinese institutions are not well known to AFD or to the Western donors, although they are very significant by the amount of loans they extend. And what we've been trying over the last 3 years is build a relationship in a few countries, particularly in Africa and also in Sri Lanka that we mentioned, to find out how we can work with CDB and apply the rules we as ODA provider must play by. This is an ongoing work. It's complicated, but we have reached a significant progress, and we expect this progress to lead to a few instances where we can show that we are able to work together, co-finance projects, and this is what we are doing. And one of the reasons we do that is we are also aware that OECD and the ODA policy has had failures over the last 40 years, and we would like to help China to avoid to make the same failures. We also have to remember that 20 years ago, well, less than 20 years ago, 18 actually, the AFD's ODA was tight. And things have changed dramatically ever since we untied our aid. So this is also part of the picture.
Thank you so much, Rémi. And actually, you answered one of the questions that came in the chat while you were speaking, which are what are the possibilities for joint financing with other countries and China. I think coming back, very interesting and fascinating questions from the audience, so thanks a lot for that. One question that I have, and that pertains to what you were saying earlier, Thomas, is what makes the added value of Chinese loans compared to other donors? And I think it might be interesting to get to that, especially as a complement to what Agatha said earlier. So maybe let's talk about that, and then I have another set of questions too.
I mean, very quickly, and I think you might say the same, but the added value is not so much in terms of interest rate. Once again, interest rates in China are higher. Not so much in terms of grace period, repayment period. They're pretty similar to ODA. They're a little bit better sometimes they're a little bit worse, but it's not so much the terms of the loan. What's really important is the availability of China's financing to countries that don't have other avenues for financing, which we're seeing here on my slide. Angola, Pakistan, Ecuador, countries like this, which have repeatedly run into trouble trying to find financing for some of their infrastructure projects, energy projects, that couldn't find them either on international market or with international multilateral financiers, and went to China, turned to China to get a project financed. The Standard Gauge Railway, as a matter of fact, is one case where Kenya had been looking around for financing for a project that it considered to be extremely important for its development, hadn't found any financiers, and Exim stepped in and proposed a loan. So to me, at least, the biggest point of attractiveness is just availability for countries that wouldn't have access in other cases.
Maybe I would just add to what Agatha said, volume. Because Chinese banks, due to their huge domestic activities, have a huge level of capital, which means they can extend loans of bigger size than traditional donors because of the strength that is given to them by their domestic activities. So it means they can loan, they can go as far as $1 billion, sometimes 2, even more, because as a part of their share of their capital, it's relatively modest. At AFD, typically, we cannot lend to a country more than 1.5 billion, but all loans combined. So it means we'll reach our maximum ceiling relatively rapidly compared to Chinese banks, due to the fact that they have such important domestic activities, in particular for CDB, which is 90% domestic and only 10% overseas.
Thanks a lot. One question that's directly addressed to Agatha, but of course, Rémi and Thomas, you can pitch in if you want. The question is, according to Ms. Kratz, Chinese loans, and there's no mention precisely of which loans we're talking about, are not viable. But can we not say that that is because China is loaning to very poor countries that are not really helped, notwithstanding?
So I don't know if the distinction is poor country more so than financially distressed country. Once again, if we look at China's portfolio of lending, you see Ecuador, you see Venezuela at 20 billion, you see Angola at 15 billion, you see Pakistan at almost, I think, 19 billion or more than that. It could be up to 30. And so it's not so much poor countries, it's unsustainable macroeconomic environment, fiscal, financial environment, and that's really a problem. Now, criticism granted, ODA flows to countries with a higher risk. So when I compare the NPL of Chinese banks, Exim and CDB, and say that it's 20%, of course it shouldn't be compared to the 1.9% in the US of NPL levels, shouldn't be compared to 3% in Europe, which is the NPL level at the moment in Europe, probably much closer, and I would love to hear my colleagues' perception of what your own acceptable level is. Shouldn't be compared to the EU or the US, it should be compared to World Bank and AFD. And that might be a little bit higher. Nevertheless, between 1 in 5 or 1 in $4 being extended and coming under renegotiation means a big problem at the end of the day.
Do you want to pitch in? If not, we can move on to another question too.
Maybe just a comment for, of course, it's partly the job of development banks to take risks. So it means our target is not to have 0% of non-performing loans. Because what our shareholder and the French state asks us is to take risk and finance projects which would not be financed otherwise. So to answer Agatha's questions, of course we are not happy when a loan proves to be unsustainable. But in general, if in our portfolio we'd had 0 non-performing loans, it would mean that strategically we probably don't have much added value. So currently we are between 3-4% of non-performing loans, a maximum 5 being a sort of a maximum to sustain our economic model. But that's the kind of range that we're targeting. But again, we are not targeting 0% of NPLs, because it would mean that we only finance those who don't necessarily need it. So our job is really to measure risk, but not to target 0 risk.
If I may add to what Thomas said, the fact that AFD's policy, and in this respect, AFD is very special among the bilateral donors. We extend 50% of our global commitments to non-sovereign debtors. So a huge part of our balance sheet is strictly at our own risk, without any Paris Club parachute whatsoever, in most cases. So this makes a difference. This makes us particularly attentive to what to the kind of risk we can take. But of course, there's the percentage of non-performing loans in that compartment is slightly higher than what we record on the sovereign compartment.
And just one quick addition to that, the key distinction is, of course, that AFD extends concessional loans. For the most part, you've just said that in the discussion, whereas most of the problem we're seeing of non-performing loans with China actually come from commercial lending. So not only are the conditions going to be very, very different, but it is supposed to be commercial, so it is supposed to be market and risk-driven. And so if the risk, if that much kind of non-performing ratio was on concessional lending, zero-interest loans, which actually can be forgiven, then it would be much easier. But in that case, CDB claims to be commercial, those loans claim to be commercial, so it just complicates renegotiation, and also it's not a complete fair comparison, I guess, to AFD.
That is true. The terms of our loans, they vary from one country to another. Of course, we do not operate in China as we do in a less developed country in Africa. So that's also very important. And but everything we do is ODA compliant.
And on non-performing loans, maybe just one last point. Do you think there's going to be an effect on them in the current economic context where the capacity of banks to lend is going to be rendered particularly complicated, or do you see no effect particularly?
So what I always say, and actually it's really important to understand because you mentioned it in your introduction, the volume of Chinese overseas lending had started declining in 2017. So it's not a COVID phenomenon. In 2016 was the peak really of Belt and Road lending, 2017, 2018. As the Malaysian cases came out, a very big PR issues around the Hambantota case, but also as a number of banks, CDB included, Exim included, were realizing that they had extended too much and probably without enough risk management. Already they had started pulling back and lending much less abroad. And so we're going to see probably much more of that because already the past 2 years, those banks had realized that their risk was too high, that their lending was too, not reckless, it's too strong a word, but too unsustainable. And so definitely it has an effect, and it's already had an effect.
And it's true that we are already seeing the rate of NPLs increase globally. So it's true in developed countries, but it's also true in developing countries. So we expect probably banks to be more cautious, but for the fact that it's our job to be counter-cyclical and to take risks. Again, the only limit is that for Chinese banks or European banks, you have to maintain a sustainable economic model. But in that current period, we'd like to maintain or even increase our activity. But of course, it's more difficult considering that the environment is more risky and therefore challenges the economic model of development banks.
I have 3 questions for the 3 of you. One you've started replying to is, do you see any change in the aid development assistance policy by China in reaction to the pandemic and the effects of COVID? The second is the road construction sector funding in Africa mainly funded by China? So that's quite wide, but if you do have examples, I think that would be helpful for the audience. And finally, it has to do with the OECD DAC. So the OECD DAC is the Development Assistance Committee. It sets the international standards on what development assistance is, and we can maybe talk about the Paris Club system too, that China is not part of, and I think the AFD representatives would be probably best placed to do that. What would be the role of the DAC in bringing China to participate in this global system with global international standards? And I think these are already quite big questions. Maybe Rémi, Thomas, and then Agatha?
Thank you. What was your first question? Sorry.
How has COVID impacted China's aid policy?
I can only say what I have seen or what I've heard of. And certainly, COVID has impacted China's aid policy in a few countries. We mentioned Sri Lanka because of that's the only case of seizure, the tangible one, at least, that has been recorded since the Belt and Road Initiative started. but also what is also true is that China has extended a zero interest loan, I think, of $500 million to Sri Lanka very recently to help Sri Lanka cope with the effects of the COVID pandemic and the effect of the economic effect of the bombings last year and the situation of debt distress that the country is in. That is the one. This is the instance I have in mind of China really doing something that hasn't been followed up by the standard OECD donor community.
With regards to the question on whether China can join the Paris Club, well, I think it's the position of the Paris Club that yes, the door is open. So if China were to want to join the Paris Club, it'd be most welcome. China is already observer within the Paris Club, and my understanding is that they participate more and more to the meetings. In the very last period, as you know, it was mentioned by Agatha, I think, there's a debt suspension initiative, and China participates to this initiative, partly in the terms of the Paris Club, that's for zero interest loans, and partly on its own terms. But I think the way forward is probably to try to find common ground on debt sustainability framework, as well as the social environment impact related to project financing. So it's a long road ahead of us, but if there were two separate worlds in the development financing community with two debt sustainability frameworks and two social and environmental impacts frameworks, I think in the end it wouldn't be good for developing countries. So what we're trying to do is really to find some common ground and increase both our common understanding of the risk situation in the world, but also to find common targets on how to improve the environmental impacts of the project finance. So again, we're coming from different traditions, different history, but if we don't manage to find some common ground there, I think we'll all miss our target and purpose.
Last word is for you, Agatha.
Just a word on post-COVID Chinese development financing. That's a good closing sentence. As I said, Chinese lending to the rest of the world, especially developing and emerging countries, had started declining in 2017, 2018. But what we see with COVID is two things. The first one is Chinese overseas financing all of a sudden turning a little bit more OECD-like because we see very few big ticket lending for big projects, concessional or commercial, much less than we saw before, simply because, there's less appetite, there's less resources. There's a lot of the just kind of interpersonal human resources at CDB and Exim now just dealing with renegotiation, dealing with other things. And so at the end of the day, what we see, the crumbs of what we see coming out at COVID time is a lot of grants, it's a lot of zero interest loans, and it's a lot of much more OECD-like instruments. So that's quite interesting. I don't know if it will continue, it might. Certainly the amount of commercial lending, potentially preferential lending, I would expect would continue to go down. And maybe, COVID serves as a peak moment for China as well to reconsider the way it has been lending over the past, because when 20 countries all of a sudden have to renegotiate their debt, it certainly makes you think twice about what you were doing wrong before, I guess. But that's really it. And that's the way I see the next couple of years.
Thank you so much, Agatha, Thomas, Rémi, Marina, who's been online as well. I had prepared a few, and I unfortunately have to say I'm very envious of the audience because I didn't manage to ask any of them. But clearly, I can see that there are still a lot more coming in, and this is a topic that is not disappearing. We are going to check with the presenters if we can provide, if not all their presentations, at least a few slides to you. They have a lot of work that is already out there, so don't hesitate to Google them. Have a look at what they've done. We might be able to do a second edition of this conversation because clearly it is very, very timely. Thank you so much again, and we'll try and put the replay as well online very soon. Thank you to the AFD, thank you to my panelists, and à bientôt.
Thank you, Tara.
Merci, Tara.
Merci beaucoup.